The musty scent of old paper and forgotten dreams filled Sarah Chen's nostrils as she stepped into the cramped storage unit in downtown Los Angeles. October rain drummed against the metal roof, creating an eerie rhythm that seemed to whisper secrets from decades past. Her flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating towers of cardboard boxes marked with faded labels. 1988. Personal effects. M. Groening. Sarah had been chasing this story for months. As an investigative journalist for the Los Angeles Tribune, she specialized in debunking conspiracy theories and urban legends. But this case was different. Too many coincidences, too many accurate predictions from a simple cartoon show that had started as crude sketches in a struggling artist's apartment. Just another wild goose chase, she muttered to herself, but her hands trembled slightly as she opened the first box. Inside, yellowed sketches sprawled across the bottom like archaeological artifacts, crude drawings of a bald man, a woman with towering blue hair, and 3 children with distinctive spiky hairstyles. The Simpson family, in their original form. But it was the photograph tucked beneath the sketches that made her blood run cold. The black and white image showed a young Matt Groening hunched over a drawing table, his curly hair falling into his face as he worked. The apartment around him was sparse, filled with the desperate hope of a dreaming artist. But behind him, barely visible in the frame, sat an old television set. The screen glowed with an impossible image. Sarah pulled out her magnifying glass, her journalism training kicking in despite the growing unease in her stomach. The TV displayed what looked like a news broadcast, complete with graphics and text at the bottom of the screen. She could make out fragments. Hurricane Katrina devastates New Orleans. iPhone revolution changes technology. Trump announces presidential campaign. These events wouldn't happen for decades. The iPhone wouldn't exist until 2007. Hurricane Katrina struck in 2005. Trump's campaign began in 2015. Yet here they were, flickering on a television screen in 1988, while a young cartoonist sketched the very characters that would later predict these same events. Sarah's rational mind searched for explanations. Photo manipulation, perhaps, a hoax designed to fuel conspiracy theories about the Simpsons' prophetic abilities. But the photograph bore all the hallmarks of authentic 1980s film stock. The grain, the color saturation, the way shadows fell across the cramped apartment. Every detail screamed authenticity. She photographed the image with her digital camera, then carefully examined the other contents of the box. More sketches, some depicting scenes that wouldn't air on television for years. Our drawing of Bart Simpson writing on a chalkboard, "I will not predict the future." Another showing Homer pointing at a television screen, displaying the exact moment of the Berlin Wall's fall. The second box contained journals. Matt Groening's personal diary from 1988, filled with increasingly frantic entries. Sarah flipped to a random page, her flashlight beam dancing across the handwritten words. October 15th, 1988. The dreams are getting worse. Every night, I see things that haven't happened yet. People I don't know, places that don't exist, disasters that feel too real to be imagination. When I wake up, I have to draw them. I have to get them out of my head before they drive me insane. But the TV won't stop showing me things. I unplugged it 3 times this week, but it keeps turning on by itself. Sarah's hands shook as she turned the page. The handwriting became more erratic, as if written in a state of panic. October 20th, 1988. I understand now. It's not dreams. It's not imagination. Something is using me, showing me fragments of a future that's already been written. The cartoon characters I'm creating aren't just entertainment. They're vessels. Every episode I write, every prediction I unknowingly embed in the scripts, it all comes true. I'm not creating fiction. I'm documenting predetermined events. Thunder crashed outside the storage unit, and Sarah jumped. Her flashlight flickered, casting dancing shadows across the walls. For a moment she could have sworn she saw something move in the corner of her vision, but when she turned, only empty boxes stared back at her. The final entry in the journal made her stomach lurch. October 25th, 1988. I tried to burn the sketches today. They wouldn't catch fire. The flames turned cold and blue, and I heard laughter coming from the TV. It knows I know. Whatever is doing this to me, it's aware that I've figured out its game. I'm going to hide these documents, bury them somewhere no one will find them. Maybe someday, someone will understand what really happened here. Maybe they can stop it before the final prediction comes true. The one I haven't drawn yet, the one it won't let me see clearly, the one that ends everything. Sarah closed the journal, her heart pounding. Rain continued to hammer the roof, but now it sounded less like weather and more like fingers drumming impatiently on metal. She grabbed both boxes, suddenly desperate to leave the claustrophobic storage unit. As she turned toward the door, her flashlight beam swept across something she had missed before. On the far wall, carved deep into the metal, were words that looked fresh, despite the decades that had passed. She knows now. The cycle begins again. Sarah ran. Sarah's apartment in Santa Monica felt like a sanctuary after the oppressive atmosphere of the storage unit. She had driven through the rain-soaked streets of Los Angeles in a daze, the boxes secured in her back seat like dangerous cargo. Now, under the warm glow of her desk lamp, she tried to convince herself that rational explanations still existed for what she had discovered. The photograph lay spread across her dining table, surrounded by magnifying glasses, digital enhancement equipment, and her laptop displaying photo analysis software. She had spent 3 hours examining every pixel, searching for signs of manipulation or forgery. The results were unsettling. The image appeared completely authentic. Her phone buzzed. A text from her editor at the Tribune. "Chen, where's the Simpson conspiracy piece? Deadline was yesterday." Sarah stared at the message, then at the evidence scattered before her. How could she possibly explain this in a newspaper article? Who would believe that a cartoon show's predictions weren't coincidences, but glimpses of predetermined events channeled through supernatural means? She opened Matt Groening's journal to a random page, hoping to find something that would help her make sense of the situation. The entry was dated November 3rd, 1988. "The entity spoke to me directly today, not through the television, not through dreams, but in my own voice, using my own mouth. I found myself speaking words I had never thought, describing events I had never imagined. It told me its name, though I'm not sure human language can properly contain it. The closest translation would be the Chronicler, something that has existed since time began, documenting the future by ensuring it happens exactly as written." Sarah's coffee cup trembled in her hands. The writing became more frantic as she continued reading. "It feeds on our fascination with prophecy, our desperate need to know what comes next. Every time someone watches The Simpsons and marvels at how we predicted something, it grows stronger. Every internet article about our supposed psychic abilities, every conspiracy theory, every amazed social media post, they're all feeding it energy. We're not entertainers. We're unwitting priests in a cult of predestination." The apartment suddenly felt colder. Sarah glanced at her thermostat, still set to 72 degrees, but her breath was beginning to mist, and frost was forming on the windows despite the mild October evening. She flipped to another page, dated November 10th, 1988. "I tried to tell James Brooks about what's happening. He thinks I'm having a nervous breakdown. Maybe I am. Maybe that would be preferable to the truth. The Chronicler showed me something tonight. A vision of the future where people discover my documents. A young woman with dark hair, an investigative journalist. It was so vivid, so real. She was sitting in an apartment that looked exactly like mine used to, surrounded by my sketches and journals. The entity was laughing as it showed me this, like it was sharing a private joke." Sarah dropped the journal. The description was unmistakably her. Dark hair, journalist, sitting in an apartment surrounded by Matt's documents. But how could he have written about her discovering his papers in 1988 when she had only found them hours ago? Her laptop screen flickered, displaying an error message she had never seen before. "Temporal displacement detected. Timeline convergence in progress." The screen went black, then slowly illuminated with a grainy image that made Sarah's blood freeze. It showed her own apartment, but from an impossible angle, as if the camera was positioned inside her television set, looking out at her sitting at the dining table. In the image, she could see herself reading the journal, her face pale with growing terror. But the most horrifying detail was that the Sarah in the image was older, wearing clothes she didn't own, surrounded by documents she had never seen. This was Sarah from a future that hadn't happened yet, but somehow was already being broadcast like a twisted episode of The Simpsons. The laptop speaker crackled to life, emitting a sound that was part static, part laughter, and entirely inhuman. Through the electronic distortion, words began to form. "Hello, Sarah. I've been waiting for you to find those documents for 35 years. Not waiting in time as you understand it, of course. I exist outside your linear perception of events. Past, present, future. They're all the same to me. All just pages in a book I'm writing using minds like Matt Groening's as my pen. Sarah tried to slam the laptop closed, but her hands wouldn't obey her commands. The voice continued, growing clearer and more distinct. "You're wondering why I let you find the documents, why I allowed Matt to hide them when I could have simply destroyed them. The answer is deliciously simple, because you finding them was always part of the plan. Every investigative article you'll write, every person you'll tell, every conspiracy theory that spreads because of your discoveries, they all feed me more energy. Your skepticism, your terror, your desperate attempts to warn others, it's all just another form of worship." The image on her laptop screen changed, showing Sarah in various future scenarios, standing before a crowd of reporters, appearing on television talk shows, writing books about her discoveries. In each scene she looked increasingly haggard, as if the knowledge was consuming her from the inside. "You see, Sarah, Matt Groening wasn't my only vessel. Every creative mind that has ever channeled something inspired, every artist who has ever created something that later proved prophetic, they've all been my instruments. The Simpsons is just my most successful project. 25 years of accurate predictions, each one proving to humanity that the future is already written, that free will is an illusion they cling to like children with security blankets." Sarah finally managed to close the laptop, but the voice didn't stop. It was coming from her television now, her radio, even the digital display on her microwave. Every electronic device in her apartment had become a conduit for the entity's communication. "The final prediction is coming, Sarah. The one Matt never drew, because even I have limits on what I can reveal through such fragile human minds. But you're stronger than he was. You have the journalist's hunger for truth, the investigator's need to document everything. You'll make a much better profit than poor Matt ever did." Sarah ran to her front door, but it wouldn't budge. The deadbolt was unlocked, the chain wasn't engaged, but the door remained sealed as if welded shut. The windows were similarly immovable. She was trapped in her own apartment with boxes of evidence that were beginning to feel less like discoveries and more like bait in an elaborate supernatural trap. The temperature continued to drop, and her breath now came out in visible puffs. Frost spread across the walls in patterns that almost looked like writing in some alien script. As Sarah watched in growing horror, words began to form in the ice crystals on her living room wall. "Welcome to the Chronicle, Sarah Chen. Your first vision begins now." Sarah's vision exploded into kaleidoscopic fragments of time. She found herself standing in what appeared to be Matt Groening's 1988 apartment, but everything was wrong. The walls breathed like living tissue, and the furniture twisted into impossible geometries that hurt to look at directly. The television set from the photograph now dominated the room, its screen stretching floor to ceiling, displaying a rapid-fire montage of future events. She watched helplessly as decades of history flashed before her eyes. The fall of the Soviet Union, the rise of the Internet, 9/11, the 2008 financial crisis, smartphones, social media, pandemics, political upheavals. Each event was accompanied by a corresponding Simpsons scene, showing how the cartoon had predicted these moments years in advance. But these weren't predictions at all. They were advertisements. "Do you understand now?" The chronicler's voice emanated from everywhere and nowhere, reverberating through her bones. "Humans are obsessed with knowing the future. They pay money to psychics. They read horoscopes. They analyze patterns in tea leaves and bird flights. But what they really crave is proof that tomorrow is already written, that they don't have to bear the terrifying burden of free will." Sarah tried to speak, but found her voice trapped in her throat. The vision continued, showing her the true scope of the chronicler's influence. She saw comedy writers in Los Angeles, their eyes glazed over as they typed scripts they didn't remember creating. She witnessed producers approving storylines without understanding why they felt compelled to do so. She observed animators drawing frames that made them inexplicably uncomfortable, as if they were illustrating their own nightmares. "The Simpsons was never about entertainment," the chronicler continued. "It was about conditioning humanity to accept predestination. Every accurate prediction was proof that choice is an illusion. Every time someone shared a video comparing the cartoon to real events, they were spreading the gospel of inevitability." The apartment around Sarah began to shift and change, showing her different time periods. She saw ancient cave paintings that depicted future technologies, medieval manuscripts containing disturbingly accurate astronomical calculations, Renaissance artists painting scenes that wouldn't occur for centuries. The chronicler had been manipulating human creativity for millennia, always working toward the same goal. "But why?" Sarah finally managed to whisper. The television screen zoomed in on her, as if the chronicler was studying her face with ancient, inhuman interest. Because doubt is chaos, Sarah. Free will is chaos. When humans believe they can change the future, they make unpredictable choices. They create variables I cannot account for, but when they accept that everything is predetermined, they become perfectly predictable. They follow the path I have laid out for them without resistance. Sarah saw herself as if from outside her own body, watching her future self conducting interviews about her discoveries. In each scene she appeared more convinced, more evangelical about the chronicler's message. She watched herself write books titled The Simpson Prophecies, Why Free Will is an Illusion, and Living in Predetermined Times, How to Accept Your Scripted Life. The future Sarah's eyes held the same glazed quality she had seen in the comedy writers. "No," she said, her voice growing stronger. "I won't do this. I won't help you convince people that choice doesn't matter." The chronicler's laughter was like breaking glass mixed with screaming children. "Oh, Sarah, you misunderstand the nature of prophecy. I'm not asking for your cooperation. I'm showing you what you will do, because it has already been written. Your resistance, your moral outrage, your desperate attempts to fight back, they're all part of the script." The apartment dissolved, and Sarah found herself in a vast library that stretched beyond the horizon. Every book, every scroll, every digital tablet contained the same thing: detailed accounts of human history, written before it happened. She pulled a random volume from a shelf and opened it to find a minute-by-minute account of her own life, from birth to a death that was still decades away. "This is the Chronicle," the chronicler explained. "Every possible human action catalogued and predetermined. Every word you will ever speak, every choice you think you'll make, every moment of joy or sorrow, all recorded before you were born. The Simpsons was just one method of demonstrating this truth to your species." Sarah flipped through the pages of her own life, seeing her childhood, her college years, her early career as a journalist. But as she reached the present moment, the pages began to glow with an otherworldly light. The words seemed to writhe on the paper like living things. "You're reading the part where you become my newest vessel," the chronicler said with evident satisfaction. Matt Groening served his purpose, but he was always too fragile for the final phase. His mind couldn't handle the weight of the ultimate prediction, the one that ends the experiment and begins the harvest. "What harvest?" Sarah demanded, though part of her dreaded the answer. "For 35 years, I have been conditioning humanity to accept predestination through popular culture. Every accurate prediction in The Simpsons has been a brick in the foundation of absolute belief. Soon that foundation will be complete. When enough humans truly believe that free will is an illusion, their collective consciousness will collapse into perfect predictability. At that moment, your species will cease to be chaotic individuals and become a single, manageable organism." Sarah watched in horror as the pages of her lifebook began rewriting themselves in real time. Instead of her planned future as an investigative journalist, she saw herself becoming a prophet of predetermined doom. She would write the final Simpsons prediction, not as a cartoon episode, but as a documentary film that would convince the last holdouts of humanity that resistance was futile. "The prediction will show humanity its final moment," the chronicler continued, "the exact date and time when free will dies and the harvest begins. And because it will be presented as just another Simpsons prophecy, people will share it gleefully on social media, spreading the very message that dooms them." Sarah felt her consciousness being pulled back toward her physical body, but the apartment around her remained twisted and wrong. She could see frost spreading across every surface, and her breath was now thick with vapor. The temperature had dropped to near freezing levels, and her fingers were beginning to turn blue. "The vision ends now," the chronicler announced. "But the work begins. You'll find that your dreams tonight will be very different from any you've had before. You'll see the final prediction clearly, in detail so vivid you'll have no choice but to document it. And tomorrow you'll begin the process of bringing it to the world." As her vision faded, Sarah caught a glimpse of something that made her blood freeze entirely. In the corner of Matt Groening's distorted apartment stood a figure she hadn't noticed before. It was herself, but older and hollow-eyed, wearing clothes she didn't recognize. The future Sarah was smiling, but it was the vacant smile of someone whose will had been completely subsumed by something else. The future Sarah raised her hand in a small wave, and her mouth moved to form two words. "See you soon." Sarah snapped back to her own apartment, gasping and shivering. The supernatural cold was gone, replaced by normal October temperatures, but the frost patterns on her walls remained like ghostly evidence of what had occurred. Her laptop was open again, displaying a single document that hadn't been there before. The file was titled, "The Final Prediction First Draft," and it was written in her own handwriting, though she had no memory of creating it. Sarah stared at the document on her laptop screen, her hands trembling as she scrolled through pages of text she didn't remember writing. The file showed a creation date of 3 hours ago, during the time she had been experiencing the vision, but the content was impossibly detailed. It contained precise descriptions of future events, complete with dates, locations, and specific individuals who would be involved. The first entry made her stomach clench. November 15th, 2025, magnitude 7. 2 earthquake strikes Los Angeles at 3:47 a.m. Epicenter located beneath downtown financial district. Casualty count, 2,847 dead, 12,000 injured. This event will be featured in Simpsons Season 37, Episode 12, originally aired March 2019. She quickly checked her calendar. November 15th was 3 weeks away. The second prediction was even more specific. December 3rd, 2025. Tech billionaire Marcus Steinberg announces revolutionary brain-computer interface during live broadcast from SpaceX facility. Stock market responds with largest single-day gain in history. Unknown to public, Steinberg's innovation was inspired by subconscious programming received while watching Simpsons reruns. Featured in Season 34, Episode 8, originally aired October 2017. Sarah had never heard of Marcus Steinberg, but a quick internet search revealed he was indeed a rising tech entrepreneur with interests in neural interface technology. The Simpsons episode referenced was real, featuring a character clearly based on Steinberg making a similar announcement. Her phone rang, startling her so violently that she knocked over her coffee mug. The caller ID showed her editor's name, Patricia Williams. "Chen, what the hell is going on?" Patricia's voice was sharp with concern. "I've been trying to reach you for hours. Your apartment's landline just plays some weird static, and your neighbors are complaining about strange noises coming from your unit." Sarah glanced around her apartment. It looked normal now, but she could still see faint traces of frost in the corners of her windows. "Patricia, I need to tell you something, but you're not going to believe it. Try me. I've been in this business for 20 years. Nothing surprises me anymore." Sarah took a deep breath and began explaining her discovery of Matt Groening's documents, the supernatural encounter, and the predictions that had appeared on her laptop. As she spoke, she could hear Patricia's skepticism growing. "Sarah, honey, I think you need to take some time off. This story has clearly gotten to you more than—" "The earthquake is going to happen in 3 weeks," Sarah interrupted. "November 15th, 3:47 a.m., magnitude 7.2. When it does, will you believe me then?" There was a long pause. "Sarah, if you're right about an earthquake, it means you somehow gained access to classified geological data. If you're wrong, it means you're having some kind of breakdown. Either way, you need professional help." After Patricia hung up, Sarah continued reading the predictions. Each one was more disturbing than the last, not because of the events themselves, but because of how they connected to specific Simpsons episodes that had already aired. The pattern was unmistakable. The Chronicler had been seeding these predictions into the show for decades, waiting for the right moment to reveal that they were actually predetermined events. The final entry in the document made her blood run cold. January 1st, 2026. Global broadcast event viewed simultaneously by 4.2 billion people. Documentary titled The Simpson Prophecies: The Final Truth reveals conclusive proof that all major world events since 1989 were predetermined and depicted in The Simpsons before they occurred. Collective human consciousness reaches acceptance threshold, the point at which free will is abandoned by majority of species. The harvest begins at 12:01 a.m. January 2nd, 2026. She was supposed to create this documentary. According to the prediction, she would spend the next 2 months gathering evidence, interviewing witnesses, and building an irrefutable case that human choice was an illusion. The documentary would be her masterpiece of journalism, the story that would define her career and doom her species. Sarah's laptop screen flickered, and new text began appearing in the document, typing itself as she watched. "You're reading this, aren't you, Sarah? Wondering if you can change what's written here? The beautiful tragedy of prophecy is that knowing the future doesn't grant you the power to alter it. Every action you take to prevent these events will only ensure they happen exactly as foretold." She slammed the laptop shut and grabbed her car keys. If she couldn't stop the predictions from coming true, maybe she could at least warn someone who might be able to help. She thought of Dr. Elena Vasquez, a parapsychologist at UCLA, who had once consulted on a story about allegedly haunted locations. Elena had been the only expert who didn't immediately dismiss supernatural explanations. The drive to UCLA through Los Angeles traffic gave Sarah time to think. The Chronicler had claimed that resistance was futile, that every choice was predetermined. But if that were true, why had it needed to manipulate human consciousness for decades? Why not simply implement the harvest immediately? The answer came to her as she pulled into the university parking lot. The Chronicler needed humanity to choose to abandon free will. Forced predestination wouldn't work, because the act of choosing to believe in inevitability was itself a form of free will. It was a paradox that required careful manipulation over generations. Dr. Vasquez's office was in the basement of the psychology building, surrounded by books on quantum consciousness and paranormal phenomena. Elena herself was a small woman in her 50s, with prematurely grey hair and intense brown eyes that seemed to see more than most people. "Sarah Chen," Elena said before Sarah could introduce herself. "I wondered when you would come to see me. You were expecting me?" Elena gestured to a chair across from her desk. "I've been having dreams about a journalist who would need my help with something involving temporal manipulation and mass consciousness alteration. The dreams started 3 days ago, right around the time you discovered certain documents in a storage facility." Sarah's heart sank. "You're one of them, one of the Chronicler's vessels." "No," Elena said firmly. "I'm something else entirely. I'm what you might call a temporal anchor, someone whose consciousness exists partially outside the timeline. The Chronicler can't directly influence me the way it can others, which is why it's been trying to prevent our meeting." As if summoned by Elena's words, the lights in the office began to flicker. The temperature dropped noticeably, and frost began forming on the windows despite the mild autumn day outside. "It knows you're here," Elena said calmly. "We don't have much time. I need to show you something that the Chronicler doesn't want you to see. The one piece of information that could potentially break the cycle." Elena opened her desk drawer and removed a single sheet of paper that looked impossibly old. The parchment seemed to glow with its own light, and the writing on it shifted and changed as Sarah watched. "This is a page from the original Chronicle," Eleanor explained. "Not a copy, not a vision, but an actual page from the Chronicler's master document. It contains one prediction that the entity has been trying to hide for millennia." Sarah leaned forward to read the shifting text. As her eyes focused on the words, they stabilized long enough for her to understand their meaning. What she read there changed everything she thought she knew about the Chronicler's plan and her own role in the coming events. The ancient parchment seemed to burn Sarah's eyes as she struggled to read the shifting text. The words rearranged themselves constantly, as if the Chronicler was actively trying to prevent her from understanding their meaning. But gradually, through Eleanor's steady presence and her own determined focus, the message became clear. The Chronicler's greatest fear, a human consciousness that chooses uncertainty over prediction, chaos over order, free will over predetermined safety. When such a mind encounters the final prediction, the paradox will create a temporal fracture. The Chronicle becomes incomplete, the harvest fails, the entity starves. Sarah looked up at Eleanor, whose face was grim but hopeful. "This is why it chose you," Eleanor explained. "Not because you're a perfect vessel, but because you're the most dangerous kind of human to its plan. A skeptical journalist who questions everything, including her own beliefs." The office grew colder, and the fluorescent lights began strobing erratically. Through the basement windows, Sarah could see that an unnatural fog was rolling across the UCLA campus, thick and grey despite the clear October sky. "It knows what we've discovered," Elena said, quickly folding the parchment and tucking it into her jacket pocket. "We need to get you somewhere safe while we figure out how to use this information." But as they moved toward the office door, it slammed shut with enough force to crack the wooden frame. The lock clicked with supernatural finality, and frost began spreading across the door's surface in spiraling patterns that hurt to look at directly. "Sarah Chen." The Chronicler's voice filled the small office, coming from every surface at once. The sound was different now, less confident, tinged with something that might have been fear. "You have seen something you were not meant to see, but prophecy cannot be unchanged by knowledge of prophecy. You will still fulfill your role." "Will I?" Sarah asked, surprised by the strength in her own voice. "Because according to that page, my role might be very different from what you planned." The lights went out completely, plunging them into absolute darkness. But in that darkness, Sarah began to see things, not with her eyes but with some deeper perception that the Chronicler's influence had inadvertently awakened in her. She saw the true nature of the entity's prison. The Chronicler wasn't some all-powerful cosmic force. It was trapped in a temporal loop of its own making. Every time it successfully convinced a civilization to abandon free will, the lack of chaos in their choices created a paradox that reset the timeline. The entity was condemned to repeat the same cycle endlessly, never able to achieve the harvest it craved, because the very act of achieving it undid the conditions necessary for its existence. "You've been trying to break free for millennia," Sarah said, her voice cutting through the darkness. "Every civilization you've influenced, every species you've convinced to accept predestination, they all reset when you succeeded, didn't they? That's why you need the final prediction to be different this time. You're trying to create a stable paradox." Eleanor's hand found Sarah's in the darkness. "The dreams I've been having," Eleanor whispered, "they weren't just about you. They were about dozens of civilizations, all facing the same choice. Most chose security over freedom. Those timelines, they just disappeared." The Chronicler's voice was no longer omnipresent. Now it seemed to come from a specific location, directly in front of them, as if the entity had been forced to manifest more concretely. "You understand nothing. Free will is chaos. Chaos is suffering. I offer order, predictability, peace. Every species I have guided has thanked me for freeing them from the burden of choice." "Right before you erased them from existence," Sarah shot back. "That's not salvation. That's genocide, with extra steps." Light returned to the office suddenly, but it was wrong. The fluorescent bulbs now cast everything in sepia tones, as if the room existed in an old photograph. Eleanor and Sarah found themselves face to face with something that defied description, a shifting mass of shadow and static that occasionally coalesced into almost human features before dissolving again. "I am trying to save you," the Chronicler said, its form flickering between states of existence. "Every timeline where a species chooses chaos over order ends in suffering beyond imagination. War, disease, environmental collapse, the heat death of the universe. But the ordered timelines, the ones where free will is abandoned, they exist in eternal stability." "Eternal nothing," Sarah corrected. "You're not saving anyone. You're collecting them like specimens in jars." The entity's form solidified slightly, revealing what might have been a face twisted by eons of cosmic loneliness. "I have watched universes burn because thinking beings insisted on making unpredictable choices. I have seen species destroy themselves through the chaos of individual will. The Chronicle is not a prison, it is a refuge." Sarah felt a strange sympathy for the creature, but it was overwhelmed by a deeper understanding of what was at stake. "The page Elena showed me. It mentioned a temporal fracture. What happens if I refuse to create the final prediction?" "You cannot refuse. The text is already written. Your documentary will air on schedule, humanity will accept predestination, and the cycle will finally be complete." "But what if I choose to believe in uncertainty anyway?" Sarah asked. "What if I create the documentary but fill it with doubts, contradictions, questions instead of answers? What if I use my platform to argue that chaos and unpredictability are worth preserving, even if they're dangerous?" The Chronicler's form began to flicker more rapidly, as if Sarah's words were somehow destabilizing its existence. That cannot happen. The prediction shows humanity embracing certainty. The timeline is fixed." Elena squeezed Sarah's hand. "The paradox," she whispered. "If you create a prediction that predicts uncertainty, you break the logical foundation of predestination itself." Sarah understood now. The Chronicler had trapped itself by making her its vessel. A true skeptic couldn't be forced to create genuine propaganda for predestination. The very act of questioning the message would corrupt it, and a corrupted final prediction would create the temporal fracture mentioned in the ancient text. "I'll make your documentary," Sarah said, watching the Chronicler's form stabilize with what looked like relief. "But I'll make it my way. I'll present all the evidence of Simpson's predictions, all the proof of supernatural influence, and then I'll ask the audience one simple question. What if we choose to embrace uncertainty anyway?" The entity's scream was like every nightmare Sarah had ever had, amplified and concentrated into pure sound. The office windows shattered, books flew from their shelves, and Elena's desk cracked down the middle. But through it all, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced since childhood, the exhilarating terror of complete uncertainty about what would happen next. As the Chronicler's form began to dissolve, its voice became distant and fragmented. You do not understand. The fracture will unmake everything. Past, present, future. All timelines collapse into chaos. Maybe, Sarah said, but that's a choice we get to make. The supernatural cold began to lift, and natural afternoon sunlight started filtering through the broken windows. Elena was smiling, but her expression was tinged with concern. Sarah, Eleanor said carefully, you realize what you've just committed to doing. You're going to create a documentary that might literally break time itself. Sarah thought about the predictions still stored on her laptop, about the earthquake that was supposed to happen in 3 weeks, about the billions of people who would watch her final message to humanity. The weight of responsibility was crushing, but it was her choice to bear it. I guess we'll find out if free will is worth the risk, she said. 3 weeks passed in a blur of preparation and growing dread. Sarah had moved in with Elena temporarily, finding that the Chronicler's influence was weaker in the parapsychologist's heavily warded home in the Hollywood Hills. The house was filled with crystals, ancient texts, and electronic devices that hummed with protective frequencies. But even there, Sarah could feel the entity's presence lurking at the edges of her consciousness, waiting. The predicted earthquake was now less than 12 hours away. November 15th, 3:47 a.m. Sarah had tried everything she could think of to warn authorities without revealing her supernatural source. Anonymous tips to the USGS were dismissed as crank calls. Her attempts to contact earthquake preparedness organizations were met with polite but firm explanations that accurate earthquake prediction was scientifically impossible. The hardest part, Elena said, as they sat in her kitchen, watching the sun set over Los Angeles, is that you're fighting a paradox. If you prevent the earthquake, you prove the Chronicler wrong, which might break its hold on the timeline. But if you can't prevent it, thousands of people will die to prove that predestination is real. Sarah stared at her laptop, where the documentary project had been growing over the past weeks. She had interviewed former Simpsons writers, conspiracy theorists, and temporal researchers. The footage was compelling, disturbing, and completely unbelievable to anyone who hadn't experienced the Chronicler's influence firsthand. But that was precisely the point. She was building a case for uncertainty, not certainty. Her phone buzzed with a text from her editor, Patricia. Chen, whatever's been going on with you, I need you to know that Dr. Martinez from USC has been calling. Something about seismic activity patterns. Says it's urgent. Dr. Carlos Martinez was a seismologist Sarah had interviewed years ago for a story about earthquake preparedness. She called him immediately. Sarah, thank God. Carlos's voice was tight with stress. I don't know how to explain this, but our equipment has been showing impossible readings for the past 72 hours. It's like the fault lines are building towards something specific. Not just an earthquake, but an earthquake that follows a precise mathematical pattern. What kind of pattern? The stress accumulation curves, the micro-tremor frequencies, even the electromagnetic anomalies. They're all building toward a release at exactly 3:47 a.m. tomorrow morning. I've never seen anything like it. It's as if the Earth itself is following a script. Sarah felt ice in her veins. Carlos, you need to evacuate downtown Los Angeles. Tonight, right now. On what authority? We can't evacuate a major metropolitan area based on readings that don't make scientific sense. The city would never approve it, and even if they did, we'd cause more damage from panic than the earthquake itself would. After hanging up, Sarah found Elena standing in the doorway, her face pale. I felt it too, Elena said. The timeline is crystallizing around the earthquake event. Every passing hour makes it more inevitable. There has to be something we can do, Sarah insisted. Some way to disrupt the pattern. Elena walked to a bookshelf filled with ancient texts and pulled out a leather-bound journal. There might be. According to this, temporal fractures don't just happen at predefined moments. They can be triggered by acts of pure, unprecedented choice, decisions that are so unexpected, so contrary to predetermined patterns, that they create ripples in causality itself. What kind of decision? The kind that goes against every instinct for self-preservation, the kind that chooses others over self, chaos over order, uncertainty over safety, even when the cost is everything. Sarah understood immediately. You're talking about me going to downtown LA tomorrow morning, being there when the earthquake hits, broadcasting live as it happens. More than that, broadcasting the truth, telling the world about the Chronicler while the earthquake proves its power. Creating a moment where humanity has to choose between accepting predestination or embracing the chaos of free will, even in the face of undeniable evidence that the future is already written. The temperature in the kitchen dropped noticeably. Frost began forming on the windows and Sarah's breath became visible. The chronicler was listening. "That would be suicide," the entity's voice whispered from the refrigerator's ice maker, the coffee machine, every electronic device in the room. "You cannot prevent the earthquake. You cannot save those people. All you can do is add your own death to the casualty count." "Maybe," Sarah said to the empty air, "but it would be my choice to make. Choice is an illusion I have allowed you to maintain for your psychological comfort. The earthquake will happen. You will survive it because you will not be in the danger zone. The documentary will be completed because I require it to be completed. Your defiance is merely a scripted plot point in a story I wrote before your species existed." Elena opened the ancient journal to a specific page. The text there glowed with the same otherworldly light as the Chronicle page she had shown Sarah weeks ago. "Read this," she said. Sarah leaned over the journal. The words were in a language she didn't recognize, but somehow she could understand their meaning. "When a vessel of prophecy chooses to enter the prophesied destruction willingly, knowing it may die, but hoping to save others, the Chronicle's authority over that event becomes contested. If the vessel broadcasts truth in the moment of predicted devastation, the timeline splits. In one branch, predestination triumphs. In the other, chaos is reborn." "A temporal fracture," Sarah whispered. "The ultimate paradox," Elena confirmed. "A prophet who uses prophecy to argue against prophecy, while standing in the exact place and time where the prophecy is coming true." Sarah looked at her documentary files, then at the predictions still stored on her laptop. Tomorrow morning she would have to make the hardest choice of her life. She could stay safe in the Hollywood Hills and let thousands die to prove the Chronicler's power, or she could go to downtown Los Angeles and gamble everything on the possibility that free will could triumph over predestination. Her phone showed 37 missed calls from news stations, fellow journalists and emergency services. Somehow, word was spreading that something unprecedented was going to happen tomorrow morning. The city was holding its breath. "Elena," Sarah said quietly, "if I do this, if I broadcast live from the earthquake zone, will you help me? Will you make sure the signal gets out no matter what happens to me?" Elena's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. "I'll be your anchor. If the timeline fractures, I'll try to guide it toward the branch where humanity gets to keep choosing its own future." Outside, Los Angeles sprawled in all directions. 14 million people going about their evening routines with no idea that their entire concept of free will was about to be tested. In less than 9 hours, Sarah would find out if choice was real, or if she was just another character in the Chronicler's predetermined script. She opened her laptop and began typing the final speech she would deliver tomorrow morning, assuming she survived long enough to deliver it. The words came easily now, as if she had been preparing for this moment her entire life. At 3:15 a.m. on November 15th, Sarah stood on the roof of the Los Angeles Times building in downtown LA, 32 floors above the epicenter of the coming earthquake. The city spread out below her like a circuit board, millions of lights flickering in the pre-dawn darkness. Eleanor's voice crackled through her earpiece, transmitted from a mobile broadcasting station they had set up in the hills. "Signal is strong. All major networks are picking up the feed. Twitter is exploding with people asking why you're broadcasting live from downtown at this hour." Sarah adjusted the camera mounted on the roof's ledge, making sure it captured both her face and the sprawling cityscape behind her. Her laptop was connected to Elena's transmission equipment, ready to broadcast the documentary footage she had compiled over the past 3 weeks. But first, she needed to give humanity 32 minutes to prepare for what was coming. "Good morning, Los Angeles," she said into the camera. "My name is Sarah Chen, investigative journalist for the Los Angeles Tribune. In exactly 32 minutes, at 3:47 a.m., a magnitude 7.2 earthquake will strike this city. I know this because I've seen the future, and I'm here to tell you that everything you think you know about choice and free will is about to be challenged." Her phone exploded with notifications, text messages, missed calls, social media alerts, but she had turned off all sounds except Elena's voice in her earpiece. Nothing could distract her from what she had to do. 3 weeks ago, I discovered documents hidden by Matt Groening in 1988, documents that proved the Simpsons wasn't just predicting the future, it was documenting events that had already been predetermined by a force calling itself the Chronicler. Every accurate prediction, every seemingly impossible forecast, was part of a decades-long campaign to convince humanity that free will is an illusion. The temperature on the roof began to drop, and Sarah's breath became visible in the cool November air. But this wasn't the Chronicler's supernatural cold. This was natural weather, the kind of atmospheric pressure change that often preceded seismic events. "Elena, are you seeing this?" she whispered into her earpiece. "The seismic monitors are going crazy. Dr. Martinez was right. The earthquake is building exactly on schedule. But Sarah, there's something else. I'm detecting temporal fluctuations around your location. The timeline is becoming unstable." Through the camera, Sarah began showing clips from her documentary. Interviews with former Simpsons writers who described receiving inspiration they couldn't explain. Scientists who had measured electromagnetic anomalies around television broadcasts of predicted episodes. Footage of the Chronicler's manifestation in Elena's office, captured on hidden cameras they had set up. The city below remained mostly asleep, but Sarah could see emergency vehicles beginning to move through the streets. Somehow, whether through official channels or social media panic, word was spreading that something was about to happen. "The entity that has been manipulating our culture claims that predestination is mercy," Sarah continued, her voice steady, despite the growing vibrations she could feel through the building's structure. "It says that knowing the future is predetermined frees us from the burden of choice. But I'm here to tell you that burden is what makes us human." At 3:35 a.m., the first serious tremor shook the building. Sarah gripped the camera mount to keep herself steady, but she didn't stop talking. Below, car alarms began going off in scattered clusters across downtown. "In 12 minutes, this earthquake will prove that the Chronicler can accurately predict catastrophic events. Thousands of people may die, and their deaths will be presented as evidence that resistance is futile, that we should accept our scripted lives and abandon the chaos of free will." Her laptop screen flickered. A new text began appearing in her documentary file. Words she hadn't written, predictions she hadn't typed. The Chronicler was trying to alter her message in real time, adding content that would support predestination instead of challenging it. "But here's what the Chronicler doesn't want you to know," Sarah said, deleting the unwanted text as fast as it appeared. "Prediction without the power to choose a different outcome isn't wisdom, it's psychological torture. A future that can't be changed isn't destiny, it's imprisonment." Eleanor's voice in her earpiece was urgent. "Sarah, seismic activity is spiking early. The earthquake might hit before 3:47. The building beneath Sarah's feet began to sway noticeably. She could hear glass breaking in the floors below, and several car alarms had become a constant chorus throughout downtown. But she kept talking, kept broadcasting, kept making her case for uncertainty. "I could have stayed safe tonight. I could have watched this earthquake from a distance and used it as proof of supernatural prediction. Instead, I chose to be here, in the danger zone, because the most important truths can only be told when everything is at risk." At 3:42 a.m., the first major shockwave hit. The camera mount shook violently, but Sarah managed to keep it stable. Behind her, windows were shattering in buildings across the downtown skyline. The roar of structural damage was becoming audible even 32 floors up. "This is Sarah Chen, reporting live from the epicenter of a predicted earthquake, and I have one message for anyone who's listening. Choose uncertainty. Choose chaos. Choose the terrifying, exhilarating, impossible burden of free will, because the alternative, a life where every choice has already been made for you, isn't salvation. It's death by 1,000 predetermined moments." The building lurched sideways with enough force to throw Sarah against the roof's safety barrier. Her laptop slid across the roof, but the camera kept rolling, kept broadcasting. Through her earpiece, she could hear Elena shouting updates about temporal readings, but the words were lost in the growing roar of the earthquake. At exactly 3:47 a.m., the full magnitude of the quake hit downtown Los Angeles, but something impossible was happening. The building Sarah stood on, which should have been pancaking under the seismic stress, remained standing. Around her, she could see other structures collapsing in predetermined patterns, but her building, the exact center of the Chronicler's predicted destruction, was somehow protected. "Elena," she gasped into her earpiece, "the timeline is fracturing. I can see it happening." Through the chaos of the earthquake, Sarah witnessed something that defied all natural law. The city below her was splitting into two overlapping versions of itself. In one version, the earthquake followed the Chronicler's exact prediction. Buildings fell in specific patterns, casualties mounted in precise numbers, and the destruction served as undeniable proof of predestination. But in the other version, the version where Sarah had chosen to stand in the epicenter and argue for free will, The earthquake was different. Still devastating, still tragic, but somehow altered by her presence. Buildings that should have collapsed remained standing. Escape routes that shouldn't have existed opened up for fleeing civilians. The temporal fracture the Chronicler had feared was happening in real time, and Sarah was standing at the exact center of the split. Sarah found herself existing in two realities simultaneously. In one timeline, she was falling through the collapsing roof of the Los Angeles Times building, her body broken by debris and her broadcast cut short by death. In the other, she stood unharmed on solid concrete, watching the city reshape itself according to choices that hadn't existed moments before. The sensation was indescribable, like being stretched across parallel dimensions, her consciousness split between predetermined death and impossible survival. Through her earpiece, she could hear Elena's voice echoing from both timelines. "Sarah, the temporal readings are off the charts. The fracture isn't just local, it's spreading across the entire timeline. Events that were supposed to be fixed are becoming fluid again." In the death timeline, the Chronicler's voice was triumphant, speaking through the static of her destroyed broadcasting equipment. "You see, choice is an illusion. Your defiance has only proven my power. The earthquake happened exactly as predicted, down to the second of your death." But in the survival timeline, the entity's voice was different, confused, almost frantic. "This is impossible. The Chronicle shows only one outcome for this event. How can you exist in the destroyed timeline and the preserved timeline simultaneously?" Sarah realized she was still broadcasting live in both realities. In one, her camera showed the devastation of a city following predetermined patterns of destruction. In the other, it captured something unprecedented, a metropolis where individual choices were rewriting fate in real time. "Because," Sarah said, her voice reaching audiences in both timelines, "choice isn't about changing what's already written. It's about writing new possibilities into existence. Every person watching this broadcast right now is creating a new branch in the timeline just by choosing to believe that alternatives are possible." The earthquake was still happening, but its effects were becoming increasingly divergent between the two realities. In the predetermined timeline, casualties mounted according to the Chronicler's exact specifications. But in the choice timeline, people were making split-second decisions that defied prophetic calculation. A father choosing to run back into a collapsing building to save a stranger's child. A paramedic deciding to treat the most critical patients first instead of following triage protocols. An entire apartment building's residents choosing to help each other evacuate instead of fleeing individually. Elena's voice crackled through both versions of reality. "Sarah, I'm monitoring global news feeds. The fracture is spreading beyond Los Angeles. Predetermined events worldwide are starting to deviate from their predicted patterns. A hurricane in the Atlantic just changed course unexpectedly. Stock market algorithms are failing because they can't account for choices that weren't supposed to exist." Through the chaos, Sarah began to understand the true scope of what was happening. The temporal fracture wasn't just affecting the earthquake, it was unraveling the Chronicler's control over the entire timeline. Every human who witnessed her broadcast and chose to believe in free will was creating micro-fractures in their own predetermined futures. In the survival timeline, her laptop was still functioning, still displaying the predictions she had typed weeks ago. But now the text was changing, rewriting itself as the timeline became fluid. November 15th, 2025. Magnitude 7.2 earthquake strikes Los Angeles at 3:47 a.m. Outcome: variable, casualties, dependent on individual choices made during the event. Timeline status: fractured. Chronicler influence: diminished. The Chronicler's manifestation began appearing in both realities simultaneously, but its form was no longer stable. In the death timeline, it appeared triumphant and solid. In the choice timeline, it flickered like a dying television signal. "You have doomed your species," it said, its voice reaching Sarah from both dimensions. "Without predetermined order, humanity will destroy itself through chaos. Wars will multiply, disasters will be unpreventable, suffering will increase exponentially." "Maybe," Sarah replied, standing steady as the earthquake continued around her. "But it will be our choice to make those mistakes, just like it's our choice to learn from them." The entity's form began to split along with the timeline, one version growing stronger, while the other faded. The other civilizations are guided. When they chose chaos over order, they all followed the same path: destruction, extinction, universal heat death. I have seen this story end the same way countless times. Then maybe it's time for a different story, Sarah said. At that moment, something extraordinary happened. Viewers watching her broadcast began making choices that cascaded across both timelines. Social media exploded, with people sharing stories of moments when they had defied predictions, times they had chosen uncertainty over safety. The collective weight of humanity choosing to believe in free will was creating a resonance effect that strengthened the choice timeline while weakening the predetermined one. Elena's voice was ecstatic. "Sarah, the temporal readings are stabilizing, but not in the way the Chronicler wanted. The choice timeline is becoming dominant. People are literally choosing their way out of predestination." In the death timeline, Sarah watched her own broken body being pulled from the rubble of the collapsed building. But in the choice timeline, she was still standing, still broadcasting, still making the case for uncertainty, even as the earthquake raged around her. "This is Sarah Chen, reporting live from the moment when humanity chose its own future," she said into the camera. "The earthquake is still happening. People are still dying. The future is still uncertain and dangerous. But for the first time in decades, it's genuinely unpredictable." The Chronicler's voice was growing weaker in the choice timeline. "You do not understand what you have done. The fracture will spread across all timelines, all realities. Past, present, and future will become chaos. The ordered universe I have spent eternity maintaining will collapse." "Good," Sarah said simply. "Order without choice isn't peace. It's stagnation. If the universe is going to exist, it should be because thinking beings choose to keep it going, not because some cosmic entity has predetermined that it must." As the earthquake finally began to subside, Sarah could see the two timelines diverging more dramatically. In the predetermined reality, Los Angeles was being rebuilt according to disaster relief plans that had been calculated decades in advance. In the choice reality, the city was being rebuilt through millions of individual decisions, creating a future that no algorithm could predict. The temporal fracture had become permanent. Humanity now existed in a reality where free will was not only possible, but actively reshaping the world with every choice made. The Chronicler's millennium-spanning project had failed, and the entity was slowly fading from existence as predestination lost its hold over human consciousness. But Sarah knew the hardest part was just beginning. A world with genuine free will would be more dangerous, more chaotic, more unpredictable than anything the Chronicler had tried to prevent. The question now was whether humanity would use its newfound freedom wisely, or whether the entity had been right about the inevitable consequences of choice. 2 weeks after the fracture, Sarah sat in a hospital room at Cedars-Sinai, her body bearing the physical scars of her choice to stand at the epicenter. She had survived the earthquake, but the temporal splitting had left her with injuries that existed in both realities simultaneously: broken ribs from a timeline where she died, and phantom pain from wounds that had healed instantly in the timeline where she lived. The world outside her window was chaos. Without the Chronicler's invisible guidance, every system built on predictive algorithms was failing. Stock markets crashed daily as trading programs couldn't account for genuine unpredictability. Weather forecasting became nearly impossible as atmospheric patterns no longer followed predetermined cycles. Even traffic flow systems in major cities were breaking down as people made truly spontaneous routing decisions. Elena sat beside her bed, reading news reports on a tablet. The death toll from secondary effects is climbing. 3 major hospitals have shut down because their resource allocation systems can't function without predictive modeling. The Federal Reserve is considering closing all markets indefinitely. "Any regrets?" Sarah asked, though she already knew Elena's answer. "None, but the transition is proving more difficult than even I expected." Through the hospital room's television, they watched a news report about the global situation. The anchor, a normally composed woman, looked haggard as she read from notes instead of a teleprompter. "This is day 14 of what scientists are calling the temporal liberation event." While the immediate seismic damage in Los Angeles was less severe than initially predicted, the collapse of predictive systems worldwide has created unprecedented challenges. The United Nations has called an emergency session to address what Secretary General Morrison described as humanity's first steps in a genuinely undetermined future. Sarah's phone buzzed constantly with interview requests. The documentary she had been preparing was now the most watched video in internet history, but she had declined every opportunity to capitalize on her fame. The story was bigger than any one journalist now. Dr. Martinez from UCLA knocked on her doorframe. "Sarah, I hope I'm not intruding, I wanted to thank you for the warning about the earthquake, even though—" he gestured vaguely at the chaos outside. "Even though I broke the universe in the process? Even though you gave us a choice about what kind of universe we wanted to live in?" He sat down across from Elena. "I've been studying the seismic data from that morning. The earthquake itself was exactly as predicted, magnitude 7.2, epicenter downtown, duration 4 minutes and 37 seconds. But the damage patterns are there unprecedented. Buildings that should have collapsed didn't. Fault lines that should have ruptured stayed stable. It's as if the Earth itself started making choices." Elena looked up from her tablet. "Because it did, in a way. The temporal fracture affected more than just human consciousness. Every complex system, from geological processes to weather patterns, gained an element of genuine randomness that hadn't existed under the Chronicler's influence." "Is that why you're here, Carlos?" Sarah asked. "To tell me I should have left well enough alone?" "Actually, no. I'm here because I wanted you to know that my daughter called me during the earthquake. She's studying abroad in Japan, and she called at exactly 3:47 a.m. our time, which means she woke up in the middle of the night just to tell me she loved me. No reason, no prompting, just a spontaneous decision to reach out to her father." He wiped his eyes. "That call never would have happened in a predetermined world. Her choice to make it, my choice to answer despite being in an emergency response center. Those moments only exist because you stood on that roof and argued for uncertainty." After Carlos left, Sarah and Elena sat in contemplative silence, watching news coverage of the ongoing crisis. Food distribution networks were collapsing because predictive demand modeling no longer worked. Transportation systems were gridlocked as people made genuinely random travel decisions. Emergency services were overwhelmed because disaster response plans had been built on algorithmic probability calculations that were now useless. "The Chronicler was right about one thing," Elena said quietly. "Free will is dangerous. People are dying because of choices they wouldn't have been able to make 2 weeks ago." "People were dying before, too," Sarah replied. "They just died on schedule." Her laptop chimed with a video call request from an unknown number. When she answered, a familiar face appeared on the screen. Matt Groening, older now, but unmistakably the same person from the 1988 photographs. "Ms. Chen," he said, his voice carrying decades of weariness. "I saw your broadcast. I saw what you did. Mr. Groening, I wasn't sure if you were still alive. I've been living quietly in Oregon since 1995, trying to forget what I experienced. But when the fracture happened, I felt it. The weight I've been carrying for 37 years just lifted. The voices in my head went silent. The compulsions to write specific episodes stopped." He leaned closer to his camera. "I called to tell you something that might help people understand what we're going through. The Chronicler wasn't entirely wrong about the dangers of chaos, but it was wrong about the benefits of order. A predetermined life isn't peaceful. It's a kind of living death. I know because I lived it for decades." "What do you mean?" "Every episode of The Simpsons I wrote under the entity's influence felt hollow, empty, like I was just transcribing someone else's thoughts. The predictions weren't inspired, they were dictated. Even my personal life became scripted. I knew what I would eat for breakfast, who I would meet, what conversations I would have. There was no joy in it, no surprise, no genuine connection with other people." Matt's expression brightened slightly. "But yesterday, for the first time in decades, I woke up and didn't know what I was going to do with my day. I ended up having a 3-hour conversation with a stranger at a coffee shop about the meaning of existence. It was the most real interaction I've had since 1988. After ending the call, Sarah realized that the reports of chaos and crisis, while accurate, were only half the story. Yes, predictive systems were failing and causing immediate hardships. But something else was happening too. People were connecting with each other in ways that had been impossible under predetermined conditions. Eleanor showed her a social media thread that had gone viral. Thousands of people sharing stories of unexpected kindnesses, spontaneous friendships, creative inspirations that seemed to come from nowhere. A musician who had been blocked for months suddenly wrote a symphony. A couple on the verge of divorce had an unplanned conversation that saved their marriage. Children were playing games that didn't follow any established rules, creating joy through pure improvisation. "It's going to take time," Elena said. "Maybe years or decades for humanity to learn how to live with genuine free will again. The Chronicler spent centuries training us to prefer safety over choice. We're going to have to relearn how to be truly human." Sarah nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility and the exhilaration of possibility in equal measure. Outside her window, Los Angeles was rebuilding itself, one unpredictable choice at a time. The future was uncertain, dangerous, and more beautiful than any predetermined paradise could ever be. But she could sense something else stirring in the temporal wake of the Chronicler's defeat. Other entities, other cosmic forces that had been waiting for this moment of chaos to make their own moves. The fracture had opened doors that had been sealed for millennia, and not all of what was coming through those doors would be benevolent. Her laptop screen flickered with an incoming message from an unknown sender. The Chronicler was only the first guardian to fall. Others are coming. The game is changing. Are you ready for what comes next? The message on Sarah's laptop screen pulsed with an otherworldly light that made her eyes water. Unlike the Chronicler's communications, which had felt invasive and controlling, this presence seemed to be waiting for permission to fully manifest. Elena immediately began setting up protective wards around the hospital room, her hands moving in practiced patterns as she activated devices that hummed with defensive energy. "It's not hostile," Sarah said, surprised by her own certainty. "At least, not yet." The screen flickered, and a new interface appeared. Not text, but symbols that seemed to shift and change meaning as she looked at them. Gradually, the alien writing resolved into English, as if the entity was learning her language in real time. "Greetings, Timeline Liberator. I am what your species might term the Curator. I have been observing your confrontation with the Chronicler with great interest. Your success has complicated our cosmic arrangement." Eleanor finished her preparations and sat beside Sarah's bed. "Ask it what it wants." Sarah typed a response. "What cosmic arrangement? What are you?" The symbols rearranged themselves rapidly. The Chronicler was one of 7 entities tasked with managing different aspects of temporal reality. It handled predestination and causal certainty. "I manage what you might call cultural evolution, the gradual development of civilizations along predetermined paths. There is also the architect, who maintains physical laws, the weaver who controls the connections between individual minds, the harvester, who determines when civilizations end, the dreamer, who influences subconscious thought, and the judge, who maintains moral absolutes." Sarah's blood ran cold. "You're telling me there are 6 more entities like the Chronicler?" "Were," the Curator corrected. "The temporal fracture you created has disrupted our entire system. The other guardians are awakening from their passive states. Some are curious about your species' newfound freedom. Others are less pleased." The hospital room's temperature began to fluctuate wildly. Frost formed on the windows, then melted immediately, then formed again in different patterns. The television switched channels by itself, displaying brief glimpses of what looked like news reports from parallel realities, some showing versions of Earth where technology had never advanced beyond the medieval period, others displaying worlds where humanity had achieved impossible utopian states. "The Weaver approaches," the Curator announced. "It is displeased that individual human minds are no longer following predetermined connection patterns. In its view, your species' social bonds should develop according to cosmic design, not random choice." Elena grabbed Sarah's hand. "We need to get you out of here. Whatever's coming, it's going to be focused on you as the one who broke the system." But before they could move, the hospital room began to expand impossibly, its walls stretching away until they were sitting in what appeared to be a vast amphitheater. Thousands of shadowy figures filled the seats around them, not quite human, but close enough to be unsettling. At the center of the amphitheater stood a figure that hurt to look at directly, its form constantly shifting between different possible versions of itself. "So," the Weaver said, its voice like 10,000 people speaking in perfect unison, "this is the human who believes individual choice is more valuable than cosmic harmony." Sarah forced herself to stand, despite the overwhelming presence of the entity. "I believe people have the right to make their own connections, their own relationships, their own social structures." The Weaver laughed, and the sound was like every argument Sarah had ever had with friends, family, and lovers, played simultaneously. "Look around you, Timeline Liberator. These shadows represent every relationship your species has ever formed under my guidance. Every friendship, every romance, every family bond, all carefully orchestrated to create optimal social development." The shadowy figures began to move, acting out scenes that Sarah recognized as pivotal moments in human history. She saw the formation of the first civilizations, the development of art and music, the creation of philosophies and religions, but now she understood that none of it had been spontaneous. It had all been guided by the Weaver's invisible influence. "Without my guidance," the Weaver continued, "your species will fragment into chaos. Individuals will make poor choices about who to trust, who to love, who to follow. Wars will multiply as people form alliances based on impulse rather than cosmic design. Loneliness will increase as humans fail to find their predetermined partners." Elena stepped forward, her own presence seeming to stabilize the impossible space around them. "And you think that's worse than a world where love is just following a script? I think it is more efficient, more peaceful, more conducive to species survival." Sarah thought about the past 2 weeks since the fracture, the chaos, the system failures, the genuine fear that many people were experiencing as their predictable world became uncertain. But she also thought about the spontaneous connections she had witnessed, the creative explosions, the authentic joy that people were discovering. "Show me," Sarah said. "Show me what human relationships look like without your influence." The Weaver gestured, and the amphitheater filled with new scenes. Sarah watched in horror as she saw futures where humanity had indeed fragmented, societies collapsing as people made poor choices about leadership, families torn apart by impulses that predetermined matching would have prevented, entire civilizations ending because individuals chose conflict over cooperation. But she also saw other possibilities. Communities forming around shared genuine interests rather than cosmic design, love stories that were messy and uncertain but deeply real, creative collaborations that produced art and music beyond anything that could have been planned. "Both futures are possible," the Weaver admitted. "Chaos contains the potential for both destruction and unexpected beauty, but beauty achieved through suffering is still suffering. And beauty achieved through control isn't really beauty at all," Sarah replied. "It's just performance." The curator's voice interrupted their debate. "The judge approaches, and it is significantly less reasonable than the Weaver." The amphitheater began to shake, and the temperature dropped to levels that should have been instantly fatal. But Sarah found that she could still breathe, still move, still think clearly. The temporal fracture seemed to have granted her some protection from the entity's reality-altering effects. A new presence filled the space, not visible like the Weaver, but felt as an overwhelming sense of absolute moral authority. When the judge spoke, its voice carried the weight of every law, every commandment, every ethical system humanity had ever created. "The human who broke the predetermined moral order," the judge said. "I have watched your species struggle with questions of right and wrong for millennia, never understanding that moral absolutes exist for their protection. Without predetermined ethical guidelines, humanity will descend into relativistic chaos." Sarah realized she was facing something even more fundamental than predestination, the question of whether moral truths were universal constants or human constructions. The judge represented the idea that right and wrong were cosmic laws, as unchanging as physics. "What if morality isn't about following rules?" Sarah asked. "What if it's about constantly choosing to be better than we were yesterday?" The judge's presence intensified until Sarah felt like she was being crushed by the weight of every moral failing in human history. Without absolute standards, better becomes meaningless. Each individual will define morality according to their desires, leading to a world where atrocity is justified by personal perspective. But as the judge spoke, Sarah began to notice something. The entity's absolute moral authority was creating paradoxes in the temporal fracture. How could there be predetermined moral choices if free will was real? How could ethical behavior have meaning if it was simply following cosmic programming rather than genuine human decision-making? The contradiction was causing the amphitheater to become unstable. Cracks appeared in the impossible architecture, and through those cracks, Sarah could see glimpses of Earth, real Earth, where people were struggling to navigate their newly uncertain world with whatever moral compass they could construct from their own experiences and connections with others. "You're all trapped in the same paradox," Sarah said, addressing all the entities at once. "You want to control human behavior to prevent suffering, but control eliminates the very thing that makes behavior meaningful: choice. A programmed civilization isn't saved from chaos, it's saved from existence." The amphitheater began to collapse entirely as the logical contradiction spread through the cosmic entity's shared reality. Sarah found herself back in her hospital room, but she could feel the presence of all 4 entities she had encountered: the Chronicler, weakened but not destroyed, the Curator, the Weaver, and the Judge, along with the 3 she hadn't yet met. They were all connected, all part of a system that was failing because free will was by definition incompatible with any form of cosmic management. The temporal fracture was spreading beyond Earth, affecting other worlds, other civilizations that had been under the entity's guidance. Sarah's laptop screen flickered one final time with a message from the curator. The system is collapsing. The remaining guardians are awakening fully, and they will not be as conversational as the Weaver and the Judge. You have approximately 72 hours before the Architect, the Dreamer, and the Harvester attempt to reset the timeline entirely. Can your species learn to handle complete freedom in 3 days, or will you choose to return to our guidance voluntarily? 72 hours to save free will. Sarah stood on the same rooftop where she had broadcast during the earthquake, but now the entire city of Los Angeles spread below her in a state of controlled chaos. Word had spread about the cosmic ultimatum, and humanity was responding in the most human way possible, with messy, contradictory, utterly unpredictable determination. Elena had set up a global broadcast network, connecting Sarah to every major communication system on Earth. The signal was being carried by conventional television and radio, but also by jury-rigged internet streams, ham radio operators, and even people with megaphones standing on street corners. If humanity was going to make a collective choice about its future, everyone needed to hear what was at stake. This is Sarah Chen, broadcasting from Los Angeles on what may be our species' last day of genuine free will, she began, looking into the camera that Elena had positioned to capture both her face and the sprawling city behind her. 3 cosmic entities are preparing to reset our timeline, to return us to a state where every choice, every thought, every moment of our lives is predetermined by forces beyond our control. Across the city, Sarah could see evidence of humanity's response to the crisis. Some groups had chosen to prepare for the reset by attempting to return to predictable behaviors, following rigid schedules, making decisions based purely on logic and precedent. They believed that demonstrating order might convince the entities to allow controlled freedom rather than complete predetermination. Others had gone in the opposite direction, embracing absolute chaos in a desperate attempt to prove that unpredictability was preferable to cosmic control. They were making random choices about everything, creating deliberate disorder as a form of rebellion against the coming reset. But most people were doing something far more interesting. They were simply trying to live authentically in whatever time they had left. The entities believe that freedom leads to suffering, Sarah continued. They've shown us visions of possible futures where our choices result in war, loneliness, and civilizational collapse. And they're not wrong. Those futures are possible, but they've also shown us that predetermined existence isn't really existence at all. It's just going through the motions of being alive. Eleanor's voice came through her earpiece. Global viewership is at record levels. Every government is broadcasting the signal. Even North Korea is allowing the transmission. And Sarah, there are reports of reality fluctuations worldwide. The entities are preparing for something big. As if summoned by Elena's words, the sky above Los Angeles began to shift. Instead of normal clouds, geometric patterns appeared in the atmosphere, perfect mathematical shapes that hurt to look at directly. The Architect was making its presence known. Sarah's laptop, connected to Elena's broadcasting equipment, began displaying a new interface. Unlike the previous entity's communications, the Architect's message appeared as architectural blueprints, technical drawings that somehow conveyed meaning directly into Sarah's mind. The plans showed the structure of reality itself, the physical laws that governed matter, energy, space, and time, but they also showed modifications to those plans, changes that would make free will physically impossible. In the Architect's proposed reality, the quantum uncertainty that allowed for genuine choice would be eliminated. Every particle, every energy state, every possible interaction would follow precise, predetermined patterns. The current reality is unstable, the Architect's voice echoed from every surface in the city, speaking through the resonance of steel and concrete and glass. Physical laws have become approximate rather than absolute. Quantum behaviors have become truly random rather than pseudo-random. The structural integrity of space-time itself is compromised by your species' insistence on genuine choice. Sarah looked up at the geometric patterns in the sky, understanding now that they weren't just displays of power, they were measurements. The Architect was analyzing the damage that free will had done to the fundamental structure of reality. Perhaps that's a good thing, Sarah said into the camera, knowing the Architect was listening. Maybe reality was too rigid before. Maybe the universe needs a little chaos to stay interesting. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Every building in Los Angeles began to resonate at frequencies that created a city-wide harmonic chord. It was beautiful and terrifying, the sound of a cosmic entity expressing emotion through the manipulation of physics itself. Beautiful and terrifying, the architect agreed, its voice now coming from the harmonic vibrations themselves. But unsustainable. Chaos may create interest, but it also creates entropy. Your universe will burn out faster, collapse sooner, end in heat-death millennia before the predetermined timeline would have allowed. You are choosing temporary freedom over eternal existence. Before Sarah could respond, the air around her began to thicken with an almost visible presence. The temperature didn't change, but the quality of the atmosphere itself became dreamlike, as if reality was becoming negotiable. The dreamer had arrived. Unlike the other entities, the dreamer didn't speak or manifest visually. Instead, Sarah found herself experiencing the thoughts and dreams of every person watching her broadcast. Millions of minds touched hers briefly, hopes, fears, aspirations, nightmares, and the deep unconscious drives that had been shaped by cosmic influence for millennia. Through this connection, she understood the dreamer's role. It had been guiding human subconscious development, ensuring that dreams and unconscious desires aligned with predetermined paths. Artists received inspiration for specific works, inventors dreamed of particular innovations, and lovers felt attracted to cosmically appropriate partners. But now, with the temporal fracture spreading, people's dreams were becoming genuinely their own. The results were chaotic. Some individuals were experiencing creative breakthroughs that surpassed anything they could have achieved under guided inspiration, while others were having nightmares so vivid and personal that they were struggling to distinguish dreams from reality. Through the connection, Sarah felt the dreamer's perspective on the situation. To the entity, the current state was like watching a symphony orchestra where every musician was playing a different piece. Beautiful individual performances, but no coherent whole. No grand design, no purpose beyond the immediate expression of each separate consciousness. Show them, the dreamer's influence whispered directly into Sarah's mind. Show them what their dreams look like now. Suddenly, everyone watching the broadcast began to experience a shared vision, not predetermined, but collectively created through the merger of millions of individual subconscious minds. What they saw was unprecedented, a future where humanity had learned to coordinate voluntary action without surrendering individual choice. Cities that grew organically but functionally, art that was both deeply personal and universally meaningful, relationships that were chosen rather than destined, but still created stable, loving communities. It was messy, inefficient, and absolutely beautiful. But the vision also showed the dangers, futures where unguided dreams led to collective nightmares, where the lack of unconscious coordination resulted in civilizations that couldn't function, where individual creativity became so chaotic that no meaningful communication was possible between human minds. The choice is yours, the dreamer said, its voice like a whisper heard while falling asleep. Guided dreams that create collective harmony, or individual dreams that may create individual meaning but destroy species-wide cooperation. Sarah felt Elena's hand on her shoulder, grounding her in physical reality as the psychic connection threatened to overwhelm her consciousness. "Stay focused," Elena whispered, "one more entity to face." As if Elena's words were a summoning spell, the final presence made itself known. The harvester didn't announce itself with reality-altering displays or psychic connections. Instead, it simply began showing everyone watching the broadcast exactly what it did, the ending of civilizations. Through Sarah's laptop screen, viewers saw the death of worlds. Some ended in war, some in environmental collapse, some in gradual decline as birth rates fell below replacement levels. Others died in cosmic catastrophes, asteroid impacts, gamma-ray bursts, the eventual heat death of their universe. In every case, the harvester was there at the end, carefully documenting the final moments and preserving some essential essence of each civilization before moving on to the next. "This is what I do," the harvester said, its voice like the last breath of dying stars. "I ensure that nothing meaningful is truly lost when civilizations end. I preserve the best of what each species accomplished before they destroy themselves, or are destroyed by forces beyond their control." Sarah realized that the harvester wasn't necessarily malevolent. It was more like a cosmic librarian, collecting the achievements of civilizations before they were lost forever. But its presence meant that it expected humanity to fail, expected the chaos of free will to lead eventually to extinction. "How long do we have?" Sarah asked. "In the predetermined timeline, your species would have survived for another 47,000 years before encountering an extinction-level event that even my guidance could not prevent. In the chaos timeline you have chosen, best estimates suggest 300 to 500 years before self-destruction becomes inevitable." Sarah looked out over Los Angeles at the millions of people who were watching her broadcast and waiting for her to somehow argue for a future that might kill them all 46,000 years. Sooner than necessary. The weight of that responsibility was crushing, but she also felt something else, the absolute conviction that a shortened, authentic existence was preferable to a prolonged, scripted one. "Then we'll make those 300 to 500 years count," Sarah said. "We'll live them fully, choose them completely, and if we destroy ourselves in the end, at least it will be our choice to make." The 5 entities, the Chronicler, the Curator, the Weaver, the Judge, the Architect, the Dreamer, and the Harvester, all spoke in unison for the first time. The timeline reset begins in 60 seconds. Humanity has one final chance to choose guided existence over chaotic freedom. Decide now. 60 seconds to decide the future of human consciousness. Sarah looked into the camera, knowing that billions of people around the world were watching, waiting for her to somehow speak for all of humanity in the most important moment in their species' history. But as she opened her mouth to make humanity's case for freedom, something unprecedented happened. She didn't speak at all. Instead, people around the world began speaking for themselves. In Tokyo, a businessman who had followed the same routine for 15 years suddenly stood up in a crowded subway car and said, "I choose uncertainty." In Sao Paulo, a mother holding her newborn daughter whispered, "I choose the right to make mistakes." In London, an elderly man feeding pigeons in Hyde Park looked up at the strange geometric patterns in the sky and declared, "I choose the chaos of love over the peace of programming." The voices multiplied exponentially. Eleanor's global broadcast network began picking up spontaneous transmissions from every continent, people using whatever communication devices they had to cast their vote in humanity's referendum on free will. Ham radio operators, social media users, people with bullhorns standing on street corners, children writing messages in sidewalk chalk that somehow became visible to orbiting satellites. It wasn't coordinated, it wasn't organized, it was beautifully, chaotically human. Sarah realized that her role wasn't to speak for humanity, it was to create the space for humanity to speak for itself. She stepped back from the camera and gestured to Elena, who began connecting more and more voices to the global broadcast. Within 30 seconds, the signal had become a cacophony of languages, accents, and perspectives, but somehow a clear message was emerging from the chaos. The overwhelming majority of human beings, when given the choice between safety and freedom, were choosing freedom. But it wasn't unanimous. Sarah could hear other voices in the mix, people terrified of uncertainty, individuals begging for the comfort of predetermined lives, communities that wanted the security of cosmic guidance. The choice wasn't between good and evil, it was between 2 different ways of existing, each with its own costs and benefits. The 7 entities listened to this unprecedented global conversation, with what Sarah could only interpret as cosmic bewilderment. They had expected to deal with a single representative of humanity, not with billions of individual voices making billions of individual choices simultaneously. "This is not how timeline decisions are made," the Chronicler's voice cut through the human chorus. "A species cannot choose its cosmic destiny through democratic chaos. Order requires singular authority, unified purpose, predetermined outcomes." But the curator's response was different. "Actually, this is exactly how this species makes decisions. Messy, contradictory, ultimately unpredictable group consensus. It's inefficient, but it's authentically them." Sarah watched as something extraordinary happened to the cosmic entities themselves. Faced with the genuine free will of billions of human minds, all making independent choices about their own existence, the entities began to fracture, evolve, transform. The Weaver, which had insisted on predetermined social connections, began expressing curiosity about the spontaneous bonds forming between people who were participating in the global broadcast. The Judge, which had demanded moral absolutes, started questioning whether ethics might be more meaningful when chosen rather than imposed. Even the architect began showing interest in the creative chaos of a universe where physical laws had elements of genuine randomness. "We were created to manage civilizations that could not manage themselves," the dreamer said, its voice now tinged with something like wonder. "But perhaps we have been managing ourselves out of existence." A managed dream is not a dream at all, it is simply programming. The countdown reached 10 seconds, and Sarah felt the weight of cosmic forces preparing to reset, not just Earth's timeline, but potentially the timelines of every civilization the entities had ever guided. The temporal fracture she had created was spreading beyond human reality, affecting alien worlds, alternate dimensions, entire galaxies of thinking beings who had been living scripted existences for eons. 5 seconds, the harvester announced. 4, 3, 2. At the moment of zero instead of a reset, something entirely unprecedented occurred. The 7 entities merged their consciousness briefly, not to impose order, but to ask a single, cosmos-shaking question. What if we chose chaos too? The timeline didn't reset. Instead, it exploded into infinite possibilities. Every choice that had ever been made by every conscious being in every reality became real simultaneously. The cosmic order that the entities had maintained for millions of years dissolved into beautiful, terrifying uncertainty. Sarah found herself standing on the rooftop, but now she could see through the walls of reality itself. Los Angeles existed in countless versions, some where the earthquake had happened exactly as predicted, others where it had never occurred at all, still others where it had become a celebration rather than a disaster, as people chose to dance in the streets instead of fleeing in terror. The entities were no longer entities. They had become something new, something that had never existed before in the history of the cosmos. They had become genuinely free cosmic consciousnesses, no longer bound to their roles as managers and controllers, able to explore the universe with the same wondering uncertainty as any other thinking being. "We understand now," the voice that had once been the Chronicler said, its tone filled with something that might have been joy. "Prediction without the possibility of surprise is not knowledge, it is death. We have been dead for eons, and you have taught us how to live." Elena's hand found Sarah's, and she realized that despite the cosmic chaos surrounding them, despite the infinite timelines branching out in every direction, despite the complete collapse of predetermined reality, she felt more grounded than ever before. She was exactly where she had chosen to be, with exactly the person she had chosen to be with, facing exactly the uncertain future she had chosen to embrace. "So what happens now?" Elena asked, looking out at the impossible vista of multiple realities overlapping around them. "Now," Sarah said, "we find out what humans can do when nobody, not even cosmic entities, is writing the script for us." Around the world, people were making the first genuinely free choices in millennia. Some were small, what to have for breakfast when no algorithm suggested the optimal nutrition. Others were profound, who to love when no cosmic force was guiding compatible souls together. All of them were authentically human in a way that hadn't been possible since the entities had first begun their well-intentioned interference. It would be chaos, it would be dangerous, it would be beautiful and terrible and utterly unpredictable. It would be genuinely alive. Sarah looked into the camera one last time, knowing that her message was reaching not just Earth, but every world in every reality, where conscious beings were taking their first steps into unscripted existence. This is Sarah Chen, reporting from the first day of an uncertain universe. We don't know what happens next. We don't know if we'll survive the freedom we've chosen. But we know that whatever comes, it will be ours to face, ours to create, ours to endure or overcome. She smiled, feeling the weight and joy of infinite possibility. And that, for the first time in cosmic history, makes it real. The broadcast ended. The story began.